All right. Hello, everyone. I haven't done a YouTube video probably what seems like a long time. But to allow you guys to catch up, I've been working a lot on what I call the philosophy of timing. And those that have kind of encountered my Substack before, the philosophy of timing essentially is that time and action together is what results into timing. And I think, as Daniel Garner, put it succinctly, like we have a tendency to think of time as like space. We are beings in time, and because we are beings in time, there is a result of that being in time, sort of action plus time as timing. Because even if we consider, why we appear in existence at certain moments in time, there's always that sort of haunting element of timing that perhaps gives us more anxiety about why do I exist here right now in this current moment in time. And even a lot of the philosophical questions about life in general have to do with not about time, but about timing, about why is there something rather than nothing, right? This element of timing. So recapping a lot of my philosophy of time, I have summarized it in a term that I call when. So timing is about when. When do you take responsibility for the actions that we do in time? Um, and on a very, I guess, simple note, right? This isn't anything new, right? People tell you all the time, take responsibility for your actions and so on. But nobody talks about those moments, about how do we take responsibility for when we did the right or the wrong thing, and how to sublimate that into a sort of creative productivity, a creative action, um, as a part of the timing itself. So that means that not only do we have to take a responsibility for our timing of when, but today I will be adding the other elements of my philosophy of timing, of what I call the more salvific when that must, in essence, never arrive. And yet it is the very thing that provokes us to engage and be in the world. And I think when is a powerful sort of timing term because, and this actually makes me want to think a little bit now about the difference between our language of timing, our language of time, and then our language of timing. Because our language of timing is a provocation for when. Like when someone says, when are you going to do the dishes? It is a sort of open-ended question that is provoked upon you, to which you can then respond, I don't know, maybe tomorrow, maybe today I'll do it. But this very provocation of the question of when are you going to do the dishes, for example? When are you going to change your life? This is the language of timing. When. The language of timing is, at least in the futural sense, this open-ended future that we cannot calculate. But it is a matter of when. So I take it from, and in my opinion, this is more on the discourse of the subject, whereas I think Caputo talks about the event, it's a perhaps, but I think on the discourse of the subject, there's perhaps, but I think from our side, it is a matter of not perhaps, but a matter of when. Because if we are being called by the event, and I don't want to go like all the way into like Caputo's thought of like the theology of the perhaps and God as an event, the name that calls. Um, but it would seem that his theology of the perhaps is also what I am calling the philosophy of timing. Um, but I think also in conjunction with his theology of perhaps, there is a sort of just as spooky as the perhaps is the spookiness of when, um, which gives rise to a lot of anxiety about when. If you really think about it, there's a couple of affirmative that we can be for sure of. It's not a maybe, it's not a maybe or perhaps that you may die or die. I mean, of course, it's always a perhaps that you may die tomorrow or die today. But in the long term of it, it actually is a matter of when. When am I going to die? So this fluctuation between Caputo's theology of perhaps, which I believe is a language for the philosophy of timing, and then my notion of the nature of when is also in the philosophy of timing, or the language of the philosophy of timing, is that when you extend this perhaps, it's a matter of when. But when is such a provocative word when put into a question, that when someone says, when are you going to do this? There's moments where that can be rhetorical, but there's genuine moments where someone says, well, when are you going to, so and so? And you can tell that when is a sort of calling for a responsibility for you to act in time. It's a calling for you to respond, to do something, and yet it doesn't demand exactly when to respond. That is the irony about the philosophy or the timing of when, is that when someone says, when are you going to do the dishes? It's sort of open-ended. This is an open-ended language of the philosophy of timing. And yet when needs to never arrive, which I know that sounds sort of counterintuitive. Like when someone says, when are you going to do the dishes? Almost presupposes that at one point he's going to do it. But actually, when is always sort of extending itself. It would seem it's always extending itself to this more immediate calling or demand for us to act, and that even when we do act, we don't even know when we will see or understand the act that we've done. And so it keeps open this sustaining of uncertainty, which is very familiar, which is very in line with Caputo's theology of perhaps. But I think his theology of perhaps is definitely in terms of what Caputo calls the event. However, I think my sort of, I don't want to call it a theology, but maybe I will be bold and call it a theology of when, is on the discourse of the subject. Or perhaps is related to the event, but when is this sustaining calling or interpretation, hermeneutic of even when we do things and when we do actions, we don't even know when we will fully understand the impact of our actions, the impacts of our understanding, the impacts of our relations with others. We don't know when, but we always know it is a matter of when, right? So this is like the sort of double play between the past when and the futural when that always claims to be coming, and yet we never know when it's coming. And because it always sustains itself in this open-ended provocation of when, all we have to do is just, all we are raised to do is to provoke another action, right? So in correspondence to regret and shame, you could say that shame is something that we no longer took responsibility for our when. It's funny because shame is like as if when has already arrived. Shame presupposes that when has already arrived. That here I am naked in front of this, crowd, as Daniel Gardner used an example in the net. Right? Here I am naked in front of the crowd. I am now ashamed. I am afraid. It has come. The dissolution of my identity has come. Right? It's the assumption that when has already arrived. And that's what's interesting about shame, is that when is assumed that has already arrived. But what's interesting about that is that even that embarrassment is not the end. So then the word of when always makes you re-question the shame that you had in that very moment. A couple of examples can be when you look back and you're laughing with your friends. You're like, remember that time that like my shorts actually dropped down and I got really embarrassed, I was really ashamed. I was wearing Ninja Turtle underwear or something like that. um, that's the thing about when, is that we felt shame because we thought when had come, and then the future, because it's still open, we have this chance to laugh about it, and that's when you realize that shame that you had in that very moment actually wasn't as big as a deal as you thought it was, right? It wasn't the end of your identity. It wasn't the end of anything. And you were for sure certain that this embarrassment would stain the rest of your life, basically. So in my philosophy of timing, this is what is being constructed. That I think philosophy has done enough for time in general. But I think now it's time for us to move from a philosophy of time to the philosophy of timing, which, if I were to make more clear about my philosophy of timing, is that the philosophy of timing has to do more with language and with action. Being in the world, being in time, we are constantly called for things that we must or must not do. But the thing is, as Buber points out, the risk of when is that we may never discover fully the rewards or punishment of such actions. And that's why when is constantly haunting us as beings. But when doesn't have to always haunt us as beings. When can be that kind of haunting that sort of allows us to keep living, to keep thriving, or as Caputo hopes, or as Caputo hopes, puts it in his hopes against hope, is that it makes us hope against the impossible. It makes us hope for the impossible or the possibility of the impossible. So, again, just to kind of summarize, when is a salvific thing? Because it never comes. And it's because it never comes is the reason why it is a sort of salvational element in our lives. It's like the Messiah that never comes, but it's that promise, that hope of the impossible, that keeps us sort of striving in that manner. Because, it's interesting because Caputo talks about, a lot of the events that happen is there's like a perhaps, this notion of perhaps is to sort of allow for like the maybe of the impossible becoming possible. But what's interesting about when we look at death, for example, like an actual physical death, our physical death is not a matter of perhaps. Our physical death is a matter of when. And so when you extend that perhaps, perhaps can be more immediate in the meaning of like, perhaps I die today, perhaps I die tomorrow, and you're always tasked with some sort of response in your daily life of that. But in the longevity of it, in the extension of the perhaps, it is always a haunting when. And it's this when that sort of, it is so open-ended. And yet you can feel the burden of the responsibility of that when. It's only a matter of when. And yet that matter of when, that when never comes, like I've said. Because when has this funny way of negating itself the moment you actually answer that when. Because now, in the retroactive part, you go, oh, it's a matter of when I understand the reasoning behind my actions or the actions that I've taken. It's a matter of when. So here we can see the interplay between when in the past, when in the present, when in the future. And it seems like because there's always a when in the future, we have no choice but to always respond to the when. And then that when always subverts itself into a matter of when I understand the actions that I did was good or bad. A when always sort of holds risk in place, because at what point do we divide time and say, okay, now I understood the repercussions of my actions, but in order to understand the repercussions of your actions, you have to sort of divide time and say, okay, 3 years that I've done this act, and now I understand that it was a good thing. When in retrospect, if you give it another 5 years, it's possible that you might think again about maybe it was good or bad. So there's always a risk for our when, and when we decide to divide things or call things or structure things, it's always a matter of when that is sort of open-ended, that is haunting us, that is spooking us into responding and being responsible. So, yeah, I think, I think this is the next stage for philosophy. If I'm being bold, the next stage is, and I do see the movement that philosophy is doing this. Philosophy, because of the age of deconstruction and postmodernity, postmodern philosophy, I think the wrong reading of postmodern is that everything is sort of just whatever, relative, and we take off the head of any truth. But actually, postmodern in the best way would reveal to us that there's always a risk of what we do, and we can never know fully and truly the risk that we're taking or the repercussions for the risk that we've taken. But once we understand that the risk is always open-ended, that it's always a matter of when, that never fully answers itself, that we begin to see or understand the nature of or the condition of the human being. Um, I do really like how Caputo puts it, right? We make the eschatology ontological in this case. But yeah, I think that's it. All right, guys. Hope you guys take care.